All right. I'm really happy to and incredibly honored that Dr. Robert Califf has agreed to speak and be our last keynote speaker today at the annual Q meeting. So you don't know us, but this is a coalition of consumer advocates for the most part. In here also are some of our speakers and funders, but they will, of course, introduce themselves if you talk to them. Anyway, Dr. Califf is newly commissioner at the FDA, and before that he had a long and illustrious career at Duke, and also he was a member, I think, of the 1966 I'm going to get this wrong, NCAA basketball team or something like that.
1969 state championship team in South Carolina. I wish I had been NCAA champion.
All right, so I get it wrong, but I don't understand it anyway. So it's close enough. It's pretty good. And he went to Duke, so you can hear already he's a Southerner. And he went to Duke where he is a cardiologist and headed up the cardiology clinical trials, and he's a well-known trialist and went on to, the issues I know him for especially have to do with, I don't know if you're still dealing with them at the FDA, but the clinical trials being conducted more and more offshore and away from the U.S., and some of the issues at clinicaltrials.gov. And he also directed CITI, which was it is an organization of stakeholders to speed up the process of clinical trials so we all get answers faster. But that's neither here nor there. You have his biography in your folder, and I'll speed it along to the speaker that you're here to hear. So I'm Dr. Califf.
Okay, there we go. You can hear me now? All right, it is good to be here with you. I did witness a statistical artifact on the way in. My first time I've witnessed a 6-car collision. No one was hurt. It actually was just bumper to bumper. Just got, people are impatient, as you know, driving in Washington, and they just all bumped into each other. And it didn't look like any of the cars were terribly damaged, but it was interesting that 6 in a row. So I would probably not go to North Capitol Street if you're leaving in the next hour and want to get out that way. So this is a topic I really love, meaningful patient participation, and of course understanding exactly what that is a work in progress that many of us have been involved in for a while and are still involved in, as I'll show you. And I also like the second part, making decisions. One of the most memorable episodes in my academic career was when we were recruiting Susan Ellenberg to leave the FDA and trying to get her to move to Duke. She ended up going to Penn, and has done well, but at the recruitment dinner we were talking about all kind of interesting things, and she said, in academics you finish every paper by saying more research is needed. At FDA we finish our work and we have to make a decision. That's a really fundamental difference. And of course, you might imagine with my background, the general observation I've made, which I'm very driven by, is that when FDA has good information, I think it makes really good decisions. But frequently, we have to make decisions with poor information. And so I think a fundamental question that this is one contributing factor to that is patient involvement. How is it that we get to a situation where we have more decisions that are fully informed by really useful information? Second, in 2016, it seems odd that you'd even have to raise the issue of patients and consumers being involved in the FDA process and the entire evidence generation system. But it's understandable historically. And in fact, I'll admit I looked at my iPhone while I was sitting there in blocked up traffic. And because of all the events at the convention this week, I got an amazing email, which will be a lot of fun to think and write about. But it was a document from the FDA in the 60s where there was a raging argument going on over whether women were qualified to be FDA inspectors. And I didn't obviously read the whole document, but the tenor of it, was pretty obvious from a different time, and I think things were just different. We've learned a lot. And there certainly are a lot of ways to be involved that I'll go through. But it's also the case, I think, that the methods of how to be involved in the most effective way are continuing to evolve. We don't really know. We know some things that seem to work well. But again, you might argue that the whole process of evidence generation and evidence consumption are also very much works in progress, especially with the changes that are occurring in the technologies and amount of evidence that we have. So next, the sympathy part of almost every talk I give, just to remind you of the remit of the FDA. We regulate, in terms of mission, we regulate between 20 and 25% of the economy. And people tend to focus in public arenas on drugs, but in fact, food is a huge part of what we do. Cosmetics, I'll have to admit, I was not an expert on cosmetics, and I'm still not, but it's part of our portfolio. Devices are probably the most rapidly expanding part, and I was in yet another meeting this morning about the combination of biologics and 3D printing. So there you got biologic device combinations. It's fascinating and amazing stuff. And then biologics themselves and drugs, but also don't forget veterinary medicine. It's a significant part of what we do. And if you think precision medicine is hard in the human species, imagine you had 240 relevant species ranging from the cat to the giraffe, where you had to figure out the right dose and indications for therapeutics. And then, of course, cigarettes, which didn't exist at the FDA until the Tobacco Act 2008. And we've gone from 0 employees to about 800 now in this center. So the agency has essentially doubled in size since 2007. So there's a lot going on every day in a lot of different arenas. And there are many commonalities among these parts of the enterprise, but also many differences. Then if you look at our mission from the other vector, what is it that we're held accountable for by the public? Obviously, the bedrock is protection of public health by assuring safety, efficacy, and security of the products that we regulate. And that is the essential ingredient that we all know has to be maintained in terms of public trust to do all the other things we do. But right there in the mission statement is also advancing public health by helping to speed innovation. And one of the more fascinating parts of my job right now with the changes in technology is this argument that's gone on over whether regulation stifles innovation or whether regulation actually promotes innovation if it's done well. And if you're interested in this, I would point you to the next generation sequencing guidances that just came out, where at least in our view, and I think actually the field, judging from the response, I think the field agrees, by the FDA working with the NIH and going out way in front and saying, we're going to regulate this based on standards in a data commons in a public space, is really advancing the kind of innovation that we need through regulation. Now, I had another example today where historically it actually was obvious that the way regulations were interpreted had stifled innovation. And so we're constantly thinking of how do we assure safety while also creating the context for what most people want, which would be better and better products for the issues that they're facing. And then the third part of this, which I had perhaps underestimated, although I had done some research in this arena, is how do you get accurate science-based information to people? And by people, it's the entire country, which includes a broad spectrum, as you know, of different types of people with different backgrounds. And this is just an amazing challenge. If you look at recent things that we've come out with, like the nutrition facts label, just what it took to get a couple of items changed on what's on a food label. It's a multi-year process with all sorts of testing that goes on, and then no matter what you do, it's still hard to get it right for some people. One other thing to watch in this space that I'm particularly interested in and proud of, although as I've learned in this job, I can't tell you when it's going to happen. There has been an effort at FDA to figure out how you can get the relevant information about drugs onto one page. And that's through a lot of consumer input where people have said, we've got this stuff and it's got everything under the sun in it, and we can't figure out which parts of it are really important. And so watch for this, because I think it's going to be a really interesting transformation of the approach to getting information to people. And then one that really should be, people should really be aware of, and if you watch the news the last 24 hours, you saw this in play. Right now on the website it says counterterrorism, but that's changed to emerging threats to the public health. And there are really two types. One is terrorism, but the other is mostly infectious outbreaks. And you saw essentially we had to declare no blood donations in parts of Miami now because we've got the mosquito on the attack, apparently. We still don't know exactly which mosquitoes they are, but we have cases in Miami which can't be explained by travel for Zika. And the issue here is that all the things that you would do in an orderly process of developing systems, you just can't do when it's an emergency. So, if you think about Zika as an example, when we first recognized it was going to be an emerging threat, there was no way to protect the blood supply. There was no way to diagnose it. There was no way to vaccinate against it, and there was no way to treat it. And so normally developing a therapy for a disease would be a 10 to 15-year process at a minimum. And we're having to make decisions based on very little information about how to handle this. So what's at stake for us is decision making, and it's always weighing benefits and risk. And so far, I would say for everything that we've done, it's always weighing benefits and risks. That is, I've yet to see a product that doesn't have some risks. We have some that come close, and even the ones that don't have major risks cost money, and if there's no benefit, and of course regulations for different parts of the FDA actually vary considerably in terms of what's needed in terms of benefit to allow marketing and labeling. So there's always this trade-off, and this is the essence of where in the good old days, in the paternalistic healthcare system we had, the heyday of my being a doctor god, it was fantastic because we were imbued in medical school with the ultimate knowledge about what people needed. You didn't have to worry because you were benefiting from the largesse of all of our brilliance, and you weren't really asked to have input as consumers or patients, but to follow orders. And of course, all that's changing, and we realize now that in order to really understand how to interpret these things at the FDA, it's not enough to have a bunch of experts sitting behind desks or on a panel. We've got to get information from real people who have the problems that we're dealing with. So this is a little bit about the history of consumer and patient focus. And people ask me all the time, what are you surprised by at the FDA? And I could list many things, but almost all of them are more quantitative than qualitative. That is, I'd worked a lot with the FDA before, so I'm not shocked by anything I've seen. But the degree of dedication deeply embedded in the FDA to patient focus is profound. And it came up when I first arrived, and it's continued to be a major theme. And as you know, we have dedicated efforts to particular groups of people who traditionally have had difficulty getting the right therapeutics. And now, the one I'm interested in adding to this is the elderly, because if you tell me, the right dose of any drug for someone over age 80, I would tell you that you're delusional. We have good guesses, but we need to do better in this regard. And there's so many people now over age 80 that generating the evidence that we need is not an impossible thing to do. So, this is, I'm going to focus mostly on medical products, but as you think about this, as I understand your organization, you should think broadly in terms of food and cosmetics and the other issues that we deal with. But it's deeply embedded that patients are critical, not just as objects of what we do, but as being involved in what we do. And down here is sort of the standard FDA list of the kinds of things that we're looking for as we do our work in interfacing with patients and consumers. So a little bit about the specifics, and this is sort of the formula that people at FDA have thought about. There's a real art here, no matter how you look at it, but there's also an evolving science. And, I'll mention this a couple of times throughout what I have to say, but an example that's particularly interesting to me right now is that until recently, there was no technological way around the fact that we had to depend on advocates for the information that we got. But now with social media, it's entirely, and with 300 million Americans with electronic health records, with a federal requirement for a two-way interaction, it's absolutely feasible to sample the whole population of people with a relevant condition. And it's a fascinating question as to as we go through the things that I'm going to show you that we're working on, it's a really important question of when do you have a sample that gives you the representation that you would like to have to make the best decisions. I don't know why these slides have this fancy change, but that's okay. So these are some of the more granular things that are really important to us, and they range from totally utilitarian issues like we need fast, enrollment in clinical trials in the U.S. is pathetic. There's just no way around it. But also very qualitative things like, are we reflecting the outcome and quality of life measures that really matter to the people who are going to be using the products? And there's a lot of work to do there. And then this is sort of one level up, and we do see this as bidirectional. That is, we'd like people to understand better what we do. It is an amazing challenge to let people know what we do, because when people ask me that question, what are you most surprised by? Actually, the thing that has surprised me the most is how hard it is when you see something you don't think is quite right at the FDA to do something about it, because we have a lot of restrictions on what we can say and do, some of which are legal, purely legal. That is, for example, it's a crime for us to reveal a trade secret. Individuals go to jail if trade secrets are revealed, even if it's inadvertent. But in addition to that, whenever we do something that affects a part of the industry, there will be a bevy of lawyers who will contest what we're doing. And that ties up enormous resources paid for by your tax money, so we have to make a lot of decisions about things that we see that we can't act on and things that we see that we must act on. It's a different equation for that decision making that I had thought, and it purely in some ways relates to the human resources that we have that would get tied up. So here's some of the specific things we're doing. The patient representative program, which has been going on for a long time. Patients are expected to be part of FDA advisory committees. I just had a chance to meet with the new crop of patients coming in, and it's really interesting, and it's serious, but it's also fun, because you have many people who have been affected by a disease or whose children have been affected, and then you have some who are more consumers, that is, not having a current burning issue, but have expertise they'd like to lend. And this is a very important part of the advisory committee system that we have. And this is broadened out now into a patient network. And, you know, I don't think there's any dominant force in the patient engagement world, but the more we can be interconnected, the better it will be in our view. And then we had the law telling us to have patients involved, very specifically infidesia in 2012. And you'll see here written in. And as many of you know, we're going through user fee negotiations right now. And it's, you know, there are public meetings about the user fee, so I'm not saying anything that I shouldn't, but patient involvement is deeply embedded into both the device and the drug user fees that are going on. So the industry is actually paying for patient involvement in these efforts. So on the drug side, one of the other interesting things is the drug and device side sort of have gone in different directions that are compatible, but they're not identical. So on the drug side, the big sort of development effort has been in what has been called patient-focused drug development. And this is a very systematic effort being done very methodically, I would say, to bring in patient groups with specific problems and to have sessions that are like focus groups that are not focused on individual products, but focused on their diseases and problems and what they would like to see. And there's a format for the meetings, and we're now beginning to see, now that we're pretty far into it, we're beginning to see other groups, because there's so many diseases and problems, begin to take the template and do the meetings themselves. There's a report that's a public report prepared on each one called The Voice of the Patient. Has a lot of qualitative analysis in it. And the idea is to share this between FDA and industry to help identify areas of unmet need, and with a big focus on using the information to develop clinical outcome tools. And this is an area that we hope will grow quickly. Here's a list of the problems that we've already had meetings about and those to be conducted that are in the pipeline now. But it shouldn't surprise you, this is going to continue, and as we learn, we'll morph this hopefully into a way of doing things across the FDA. This is sort of the summary of the people doing it within CEDAR, and it I think has fascinated all of us to sort of step aside and say, okay, what's it like to have this disease? No surprise probably to any of you, but being as functional as possible turns out to be a key thing. But one of the parts I think that has surprised people is often the endpoints that the experts are interested in and what the patients identify as their main limitations to functionality are not the same. And sometimes it's a very specific thing, like I was looking before I came at pulmonary fibrosis, and most of the endpoints have been focused on 6-minute walk or things like that, which are important, but it's coughing that bothers these people, and that was a very consistent theme. So, we couldn't find companies developing cough-specific treatments for pulmonary fibrosis, so there's a target that could be really important. We've also heard from the stakeholders at these meetings and the public meetings that we've had, no one expects the FDA to solve all these things, but by getting this started, we're hoping it will be a way of doing things. And we also hope people will join in terms of developing the best methods for this effort. And of course, a big tool that we have is guidance, which when we put it out is essentially a playbook for industry as it does its clinical trials. And then this is a look at sort of where across FDA we think patients have a role, and it's pretty much the whole spectrum. I'd gotten very immersed in Picornet before coming to the FDA because I was co-PI of the coordinating center. And, we were working at the time on every part of clinical trials, for example. How should patients be involved? And there's clearly a role throughout this whole effort. On the device side, the focus has been more on preferences, which is a pretty, I've always been interested in this, and it's a pretty amazing sort of makes your head spin to really deal with it. I had been dealing in my clinical career with a relatively easy problem, which is how do you trade off reduction in mortality with risk of intracranial bleed in therapies for acute cardiac disease. And those are pretty discrete events that you can learn a lot about. But even with that relatively simple paradigm, the distribution of how people feel about it is pretty broad, which makes you begin to think, well, is a single label from a paternalistic expert the right way to think about this? And I was really pretty amazed to see how far the device group at FDA had gotten into considerations about these issues. And none of us would pretend that we have all the answers about it, but you'll see here, it's a standard question. If you come in with a bunch of engineers with your proposed solution with a device for a patient problem, I ask, have you talked to patients about what they think about this? Would seem like that would be common sense, but you'd be amazed how often that's not been part of the equation. So two goals within CDRH: promote a culture of meaningful patient engagement internally, and increase the use and transparency of patient input into decision making. Had a chance to co-author a JAMA perspective that you might want to look at if you're interested in particularly the CDRH perspective here with some of the leaders in CDRH who have been working on this. So the initiative has really been based on this benefit-risk framework that's been developed across FDA, and then to take that and use a patient-centric assessment. And the methods are still under evolution, obviously, because it's really complicated, but I think a lot of progress has been made in at least how to think about it. We've also developed a patient engagement advisory committee for CDRH, which is a formal way to bring in oversight. And we find advisory committees to be extremely useful. They are advisory, but the good thing about them is they get the inside scoop and have a chance to talk about it and interact with our folks at the FDA. So this is just another look at what I showed you before from the device perspective, which is, I think, different than drugs in many ways, because devices have this iterative capability. With a drug, if it's not looking good and you got to tweak the molecule, you're back at step one. With a device, you can often find it's something where an engineering change that's pretty minor can change something specific about the device that can make it better. So how to bring patients into these loops that we have is really interesting. You'll notice the communication part here at the end. And so if you look actually at PMAs coming in, so PMAs would really refer to the 1%. Remember that this is also another thing you wouldn't normally think about, but there are thousands of devices that are cleared by the FDA every year. Most of them are glucometers and bed rails and hospital gowns, just things that you wouldn't normally think about. They don't need clinical trials. They, go through based on engineering specifications. But out of 1% of devices are high risk, intended to treat major diseases with major consequences. And this is where, we think the big action is in terms of both preferences and patient-reported outcomes. And you see that it's already being incorporated into what's happening. And then, lest you think that we're only isolationists, certainly a hot topic right now, there's a cluster now, and the way we work with EMA is to identify topics of common interest and then form a joint effort to think about it. So this has made it across the pond. I'm sad to say one of the real joys of my job has been developing a close relationship with Guido Rossi, who runs the EMA, but they've got a little problem. They're located in London, and they've got 1,000 employees in a building in London. They're going to have to move somewhere, and they don't know where they're going to move, so they are pretty much paralyzed right now just trying to deal with the fallout from Brexit. But I'm hopeful when they find out where they're going to move, they'll be back on their feet and we'll be making the kind of collaborative progress that really makes a difference. Now, there's one other thing which is in the way of new things that we were just talking about on the way in. I have to say I have a conflict here because I was the originator of CTTI, but the work goes on and there's an effort there to develop a patient advocate collaborative. The reason we started CITI was that there were a lot of issues where the FDA couldn't do it on its own, and it couldn't do it by working with one organization, so the goal was to create a not-for-profit, public-private partnership, and we ended up with over 80 organizations joining up from all the different sectors working on it. Okay, one thing I'd say, and I learned about this in my confirmation, it's not speed of clinical trials, it's high-quality clinical trials. So speed would be one attribute, right? So if you're a patient and you've got a disease and you want to know whether the treatment's any good, there's no advantage to being slower. But if you're going for speed and sacrificing quality, then that would be bad. So I've learned to be careful that it's not just speed from our goal. And then there are a number of challenges, and we did a lot of work, and PCORI in general is doing a lot of work here. Oftentimes, when people want to get deeply into the interaction, there is a mutual education that needs to go on. It is bilateral. Professionals in the field need to learn how to work with patients and vice versa. And I think one thing that I really got from PCORI that I really believe in is that as you bring patients into deeper and deeper phases of things, you need to have an educational program, if nothing else, just the terminology, because you'll use terms and there can be embarrassment about asking, what do you mean by that? So we're dedicated to a strong future here. We really want it to work, but I've tried to give you a view that we're hard at work with it, but it's not like we have a finished product. And there's a lot more that can be done with both the methods and the practical reality. So this is sort of the final note. We have an Office of Health and Constituent Affairs, and we'd welcome you to get involved in the many things that we do. And on the website, you can find a lot of different ways to get involved in different aspects. So I'll stop there and see if you have questions or comments.
Thank you. Great. It takes a young person, not a village. Okay, so I hope I asked this question the right way, but I think you'll know what I mean, which is, how does the FDA decide that something is patient-centered or patient-centric or whatever the right word is, we're trying to make everything patient-centered, but what does that mean to the FDA?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you'll be okay with this answer or not, but I would say we don't have a definition. FDA spends a lot of time defining things, and in fact, we had a meeting today totally about defining a segment of research because it does help to define. But right now, what I'd say is we have a lot of different parts of FDA doing different things. I am investing in an effort to bring it together, but I also don't want to constrain it because I don't think we know enough yet to have some kind of an ironclad definition. Maybe one part of the answer would be it's easier to define what's not patient-centered. I mean, if there's a decision made at FDA and there's been no patient involvement in any aspect of it, and that is the way everything was until fairly recently. So we still have pockets of that, but there's a lot of different stuff going on right now.
All right, these are just like the FDA, they're wide-ranging. All right, so, and it could be a long answer, but it's better if it's not, but it probably is the real thing here. So the question is, how will FDA get control over off-label use of FDA-approved drugs? Will FDA ever have any since FDA, we heard earlier, they're about approving marketing, so maybe you could go in that direction.
Oh, so first of all, no, we're not about approving marketing. That's one part of what we do. We have responsibility for the safety. If you just focus on drugs, we have responsibility for the safety throughout the life cycle of the drug. Let's just take niacin. 40 years after it's on the market, it's a full generic, and someone finally did a proper clinical trial, and guess what? It causes infections and multiple other toxicities that were previously unknown. So we have accountability for that as well. But when it comes to off-label, remember that what we don't do is we don't, except in specific circumstances, regulate medical practice. So, you might ask professional societies what they're doing about off-label, and we are, as you know, engaged in a very public discussion about challenges to our authorities related to American courts' interpretation of the First Amendment, the fact that corporations have the right to free speech as individuals. But what I'd say is we're actively working on it. Since there's legislation in play, I can't be too specific, but I will tell you that there's recent pretty good research that shows something I think is really interesting, which is that this is in Canada, a really thorough look at off-label use, and the finding was that the adverse event rate, they took off-label in two categories: off-label with good evidence of an indication where it looked like it worked, and off-label use where there was no evidence. The adverse event rate was fourfold higher when there was no evidence. Mm-hmm. So that's within off-label. And off-label with pretty good evidence looked sort of like on-label. And so I think, we're probably going to end up parsing off-label into categories, but, we'll see what happens.
Stay tuned.
Yes.
Stay tuned, everyone. Okay, so I'll try to make this one shorter. So when you have small patient populations with rare conditions and they want to get a voice at the FDA for their clinical needs, an example that's given here is from the transgender community, that they need estrogen specifically for transgender women, and the dosage that's currently authorized is small enough that they need to inject twice a day, and they'd like to have a higher, assuming the safety's all right, a higher dosage so that they can do one injection a day. So it's a very small population and a small issue, but a big issue to them. And so how does FDA deal with this? When we have patient voices, it's one thing about MI or cancer or whatever, but what about transgender community?
Well, you're asking all the easy
I'm
questions.
asking.
Let me.
These are the easy ones.
Let me relate to the last issue, because part of what I meant to say was the best solution to off-label use is to develop good evidence for and put it in the label. In fact, my general view of life in this regard is that the label for the medical, as it relates to medical products, there are many other aspects of healthcare, obviously, but as it relates to medical products, the label plus a good clinical practice guideline should be the playbook. And they're not the same because what it takes to get into an FDA label is a higher standard than the probabilistic reasoning you'd want in many clinical practice guidelines. And I know their U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has sort of the right wing, I guess, of guidelines saying it's got to be proven to talk about it. But if you're a patient or a doctor and there's a 60% chance A is better than B, you'd like to know that, I think. But that wouldn't necessarily make it into an FDA label if there was a high uncertainty factor on that. So the fabric of evidence is really critical. So what I'd say about any smaller population within the situation of a product that has a label, first of all, doctors can prescribe whatever they want to within that label. That's medical practice. Secondly, you are raising an issue which is really gets complicated, which is packaging and distribution. People don't think about this often, but this is an area I've learned a lot about. In a global supply chain, companies have, pretty profound responsibilities for the quality of what they do. And it's expensive because you are responsible for making it and distributing it to anybody who wants it. So when you are a small population, that's a pretty, just the packaging, is a big issue that we can't tell companies do something that's going to cause you to lose money obligatorily. So the best thing to do would be to develop good evidence and to link people together, because most small diseases, now that we have 300 million electronic health records, they're not so small, it turns out. And there may be a population big enough to either have the evidence or make it work. I would also, in general, we have an orphan diseases group, which is there by law. They're very, that's what they do for a living. They love it. So you should come in and see them and talk about this, and we'll try to find a solution.
Maybe, I don't know if I'd call it a disease being transgender. We could look for a new name, maybe.
Well,
Gender dysphoria, it is a disease, and it is a packaging issue. That was the actual question.
okay.
About 40 milliliter availability versus 20 milliliter availability, which you do make recommendations of availability of.
Well, I think there are many issues like this that as we learn more and more, some of these things actually have to get into law in order to work, because like it or not, we live in a country where capitalism is the way, and it's hard to get people to do things that lose money unless they're required to do it.
But those patient groups that you were talking about, that's unrelated, and is there a possibility for you to convene one of those focus groups for transgender patients?
Yes.
Right. Okay. And can we call that number you put on the screen to get that to happen?
You can start, I've also learned in my job not to make any promises unless I know that we're going to do
What's
it.
the pathway?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I wanted.
All right. I'm tempted to ask my own question about labels, but I'll be fair and not ask. Okay, so I'm merging two questions together now, one from the National Center for Health Research and one that somebody asked out there, which is, the first part is, do you think well-controlled trials are essential to prove that drugs work? And the second part, which was the issue discussed out in the outer room at the break, is whether the electronic health record, and you've mentioned it at least twice, is actually going to change the approval process where well-controlled trials won't be required because we have data from the electronic health record.
The basal state for me, it's pretty well known, is that well-controlled trials are the essential ingredient to distinguish what works from what doesn't, and what works better compared to what doesn't work as well. That's just sound methodology. I would add in, though, that, and this is very clear from the patient-focused efforts, if you have a disease that's lethal, where there's no effective treatment, I'll just take the extreme example. requiring the same level of evidence you do for my disease, coronary disease, where there are multiple generic effective treatments, and if something got on the market, it would be given to millions of people. It wouldn't make sense to do that, and so we have these pathways that are written into law that don't require control trials if there's a big effect. And, I would just, with permission, I can use my mother, who's 88 years old with multiple myeloma. She just had her 4th recurrence, and just as luck would have it, every time she has a recurrence 8 years into her disease, a new drug comes on the market. So she's getting one now that was approved based on 148 patients with a phase 1 and phase 2 trial, but it was all refractory patients who had failed 3 previous courses. And you have a really good marker in multiple myeloma, which is the percent of the bone marrow invaded by plasma cells. And so that was good enough for me, and it was certainly good enough for her. So there is a framework, and of course the problem is you run into where are the boundaries on that framework, and that's work we all need to be involved in, including the patients who have the most at stake with this. But I'll also add, I've been having a lot of fun doing work with Andy Slavitt and CMS, and I think if you look at it, getting on the market and getting widespread use is an evolving paradigm in the U.S. right now. And the evidence that we'll need for the spectrum of on-the-market labeling for a variety of conditions and payment is going to push us to do trials in the post-market that are different than what's been done before. But I call randomization God's gift, because if the effects are modest, you can't, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but you can't tell. So electronic health records. This is driving me crazy. This word real-world evidence. People talk about real-world evidence as if, in randomized trials, as if they're polar opposites. And that's just completely wrong. The source of your evidence is one dimension. And so that goes from a rarefied clinic that has nothing to do with patient care, done like a laboratory experiment, to trials done in people's homes or clinics where patient care is being delivered. That's the source of evidence spectrum. And then the method that you use to draw an inference is a different axis. So we're going to have a number of things that come out that say the goal in the highest form of the art is randomization within the real world. And so electronic health records will give us a fabric of observational data that should be continuous to learn from about quality and to have hypotheses, and where we have really good evidence to fill in parts. But the greatest use of EHRs in the future, I think, for the kind of things you're thinking about, is going to be to randomize at the point of care. And that way you don't have to pay for all the data that we collect right now in a parallel universe.
All right, thank you. Trade secrets exist and are respected in Europe, yet the EMA is releasing clinical trial data, I think in the form of clinical study reports, not individual patient data. Why can't the FDA do this?
So first of all, I'm sure I know where that question came from. And secondly,
Not me.
yeah, I know. But maybe you want someone who's spent some time with you. Secondly, let me say, if you think that this is going smoothly with the EMA, you need to go to school. It's not exactly rolling out the door. And I will say that releasing clinical summaries written by the company has a lot of issues with it. And there's a history with that. So how that's going to work with EMA, I don't know. But I will also say that in general, there's a lot of support within the FDA of releasing clinical study reports that are redacted. And again, I just wouldn't underestimate the effort and work that's needed to do that, because remember, the EMA, by and large, almost never does its own analysis of the data. At the FDA, you get a totally independent analysis of the data. It has a lot of stuff in it that you wouldn't otherwise see. And the question of what is a trade secret is actually, this is another lesson for me. And I could tell you some interesting tobacco stories about this, but things that make sense in the U.S., because the definitions are different in other countries, we can't just do the same thing because our laws are actually different. And our trade secret laws are much more restrictive than almost any other country. Many people believe that's one of the reasons that we have such robust industries in the U.S., and I offer no opinion on that. I just pointed out.
Every answer you give, I want to talk to you a little bit more about.
But let me just say, we're working on it. But I just want to make one other point. If you look at what's actually happening at the FDA now, I love it, because people have talked about the fact that for drugs and devices, the success rate of an application that fully goes in is approaching 90%. So what does that mean? Well, you'd say, well, we're just like the intern that admits everybody from the emergency room. That's not the case. What's happening, the failure rate for a drug entering phase 1 is still over 90%. Even in targeted oncology, that surprises me when you say it, because you'd think that everything that's done works there. What's happening is we're having multiple meetings with the companies. They're finding out what it would take to get through, and they're killing projects that otherwise would have wasted everybody's time with an application that was going to fail. But the real nugget is those 90% of things that don't make it. There's a problem there. They're not required to report the results like they are for things that do make it.
So,
Stay tuned.
okay, great.
As you know, the final rule for clinicaltrials.gov.
Right, so rulemaking, soon.
I can't say soon.
We can't say a
when.
thing. They can't say a thing, but we will, as soon as something comes out, remember, we asked you all to comment on it, and it will be coming out soon. I'm not sure what the estimated date is.
I can't say soon.
Okay. Anyway, when it comes out, look on the Q Facebook page. We'll send out notice, because this is really important issue. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's absolutely forbidden for us to signal the timing of something, because it affects all kinds of things that things I wouldn't have thought about.
But let's just say that the FDA was 2007, and rulemaking, let's hope it's out by 2017. Okay. A lot of patient groups, a lot is underlined, are wholly or largely funded by industry. How do you guard against conflict of interest and patient influence in the various patient engagement offerings that you have?
Well, a couple of things to say about that. First, there are some documents about the city, for example, has one. And I think the empirical knowledge about how to spot legitimate from not legitimate advocacy groups is growing, and I would urge everyone to get involved in that. The second thing I'd say, it's an interesting question of whether the role of industry funding in anything. I'm in a very strange position on this now because, almost half the FDA budget comes from user fees. So there you go. And, this is laws passed by Congress that make that happen. But, it's obvious to me that technology developers, if we just sort of separate for a second conceptually the marketing part of companies and the technology developers, there's a huge reason for them to be involved with patients, and for many patient groups it's hard to travel, there's cost, et cetera. So just saying there should be no industry funding of patient groups, and they somehow, that gets into one other issue that I've been worried about a lot. God forbid that you have a disease for which there's not a great patient advocacy group. You didn't expect that to happen. There was no reason for you to be thinking about the disease you were going to get. But, if, like my mom, multiple myeloma, it's an amazing organization. They get trials done lickety-split. They're looking for investigators rather than having investigators look for patients. And they have a database that has all the information and samples in it, so the information is just turning over like that, which is what you'd want. But what if you had some disease where none of that was happening? You'd be disadvantaged. So what are our obligations as a public health organization, and what are your obligations to develop the right methods and make sure there is adequate funding for the work to get done?
This is a little different than what the question asks. It's how do you guard against conflict of interest? We understand, we struggle with it so much in Q that industry probably is one of the few sources for funding consumers. And so it limits the types of groups we are able to have as members, because members are required to have less than 50% of their funding come from industry. But your conference might be funded, or travel, as you say, or whatever. So the question, I think it's a genuine question because everyone struggles with it.
I agree it's a genuine question, but I think it's actually too limited. I had a chance to defend this publicly at the confirmation hearing, so I'll just quickly say it. There are conflicts other than the medical products industry. For example, if you work for a university, if you ask me about laboratory-developed tests, the bad actors with laboratory-developed tests are universities. They are multi-billion-dollar organizations who we regulate. And if you don't think money's important, try regulating the lab testing that's going on. So, the sort of holier-than-thou kind of stuff that I see from different sectors, and there are also ego conflicts of interest which are profound that we see every day. So guarding against conflict of interest is critical. Identifying all the conflicts and making them explicit, I think, is the best way to deal with it. And then the question of what the rules should be, I think, is one that needs to keep evolving because it is complex. Is Johns Hopkins a university, or is it a $12 billion a year healthcare system? You could look at it either way.
Yeah, I agree. And what's my loyalty to Johns Hopkins versus whatever? All right, I know we're running out of time. I want to answer all these questions, but the patient rep on many device advisory panels has no vote. Why not?
I don't know. I'll have to look into
Ask. All right, so this will be, I guess, the last question. I feel bad, but I think we have to honor our promise to you and when we said we would. So when incorporating patient preferences in a policy decision, what do you do when a patient advocate, what does FDA do when a patient advocates for something that's not evidence-based? I suppose a non-patient could do it too, but this question is...
Well, right, the proper definition of evidence-based medicine is the synthesis of high-quality evidence with preferences and other sources of knowledge, right? That was at least the last time I read it. And so I think patient input is one source of knowledge from subjective things. If the question is, what do you do if there's a consensus and there's an individual who has a totally different view of things, I think for regulatory decisions, we have to make binary decisions. I think I think a really fascinating part of this is what will happen when we get better and better preference data and we find out that there's a distribution like that's very broad, or there's a distribution with two humps in it. I mean, in an example that I had to deal with that I think actually worked out, didn't have to, it was interesting, it worked out well. There are some people who think that having a disabling stroke is worse than death, and some people that think that it's better to be alive even if you have a disabling stroke. And when you're at the decision threshold for whether to give a thrombolytic agent, for example, that will swing the decision one way or the other. So as for big diseases or for what I still think rare diseases are not quite as rare as we used to think now that we have access to more information. As we get distributions, we're going to have hard things to figure out that we don't have answers to right now.
Well, so this may not be an answer all of you agree with, but it seems to me that one of the things Q represents, or at least to me, is that our groups are from many different conditions, et cetera. And so I think of Q, instead of being a condition-based organization, it's a knowledge-based organization. And so knowledge might be a good basis for dilemmas like that.
I agree. I mean, the other thing that is just common sense is listening is a cure for over half of these situations. I mean, I'm in a lot of these situations now where it starts out contentious, and often it's a pretty simple misunderstanding. And it can be ignorance on either side about what was really meant. But I think the most important thing to do when you have an outlier in a group is to take a little time to let them express themselves. I also find that we had a big discussion about this yesterday. Sometimes you just have to make a decision that people are going to be unhappy with, but although it doesn't always work, the general rule is if you give them a chance to express their opinion and make sure that they know that you've heard it, they can live with it, particularly if you've explained why you're doing it. Doesn't always work with Congress people, but...
No, it might not. Well, thank you so much, and I apologize if I didn't get to your question. Thank you.